Some scholars argue the authenticity of St. Paul's letters, and many scholars deem only 7 of the 13 Pauline letters to be actually written by Paul himself. But what if I told you that Paul never actually wrote any of his letters? Well, I'd be lying, sort of. What I mean to say is that Paul never physically wrote any of his letters. Not that the letters we have in the New Testament are not authentically Pauline. Perhaps, while reading the Pauline Epistles, you have come across a phrase like this: I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. This phrase is what's known as a scribal signature, or an autographic subscription, and there are 7 scribal signatures found throughout the Pauline Epistles. These scribal signatures provide evidence for how Paul may have composed his letters. Following suit with the rest of antiquity, Paul likely used a scribe. A scribe was someone who physically put pen to paper, or more correctly, put ink to papyri, and transcribed what was being dictated to them. And this is why Paul, near the end of many of his letters, often adds the phrase, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. As opposed to the bulk of the letter, here Paul is stating that he personally wrote this particular greeting. And this was common practice in antiquity. Adding personal scribal signatures to documents that had largely been written by an employed scribe was done for many different reasons. For starters, adding your own handwriting to a letter provides a sense of personal connection, something the recipients can grasp onto. Secondly, it authenticates the letter and adds a level of apostolic authority to the letter's content. And finally, scribal signatures were often provided in legal documents, in the same way we use signatures today. In fact, we see Paul apply a scribal signature for its legal use in his letter to Philemon. While imprisoned in Ephesus, Paul details how Philemon's runaway slave Onesimus has become very useful to him while imprisoned, and has also come to Christ in the meantime. From here, Paul urges Philemon to receive Onesimus back into his household, but not as a slave, rather as a beloved brother in Christ. In doing so, Paul recognizes that Onesimus, during his departure from Philemon, wronged him or possibly even stole from him. So Paul writes, if he has wronged you in any way, or owes you anything, charge that to my account. Followed by the scribal signature, I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it. Here Paul inserts his own handwriting and provides his word, I will repay it. Essentially saying, you can hold me to my word. You have it in my own handwriting. As for other scribal signatures, such as those found in 1 Corinthians, 2 Thessalonians, and Colossians, they seem to be for the use of personal relations. Paul adds his greeting in his own hand to offer a personable element to his letter. And this practice was not out of the ordinary. We find many examples of this in other contemporary letters of Paul's time. For example, this short letter discovered in Egypt in the early 2nd century records a man named Harpocration asking a man, possibly his friend, Apollonius, to allow his slave to purchase grain. And after the bulk of the letter, we see a change in the characters where we read, above all things, I pray that you are well, most honored one, with your whole house. Clearly here, we see how the style of writing changes, and due to the content of the text, we can assume that this is a scribal signature from Harpocration himself, adding a cordial greeting to conclude his request for grain. But why don't we see visual evidence like this regarding scribal signatures in Paul's letters? Well, P.Gis 1.75 is most likely an original letter. We can assume this as there is no reason for a simple transactional request of grain to be reproduced. Accordingly, we are extremely lucky to have this one-of-a-kind papyri letter. But as for Paul's letters, due to their theological and apostolic value, Christians reproduce these letters to have multiple copies for the use of the greater church body who venerated these authoritative writings and still do today. Therefore, we currently hold no original manuscripts of Paul's letters, the earliest one being P46, which is actually a collection of Pauline letters dating from the late 2nd century. Without any original manuscripts, the visual differences in writing style are absent. But if we consider Paul's scribal signature in Galatians, we find proof of this historical scribal practice leaking through the copied originals. In Galatians 6:11 we read, see what large letters I make when I am writing in my own hand. Although in any version of the text we read today, the size of the characters and the style of the writing will remain the same, Paul is clearly making a sort of self-deprecating joke here, pointing out the visual difference between the writing in his own hand and the writing throughout the bulk of the letter, a visual cue that would have been present in the original manuscript. And significantly, after this scribal signature, what we read to conclude Galatians from verses 6:11 to 6:18 is likely the longest stretch of personal Pauline writing that we have. We know this due to the nature of the verses that sum up the key points of the letter. And I believe that Paul sums up this letter in his own hand due to the inflammatory content within Galatians that at some points directly pits him against other prominent apostles, such as James and even the leader of the church, Peter. And in doing so, Paul makes sure to add his own handwriting, reaffirming and authorizing his controversial writing. Nevertheless, it is incredibly interesting to have this proof of Paul's scribal signatures, as Paul makes direct reference to his unique writing style. To put this into perspective, this is possibly what the end of Galatians would have originally looked like. Having the scribe's hand above in neat lines and consistent character size, followed by a clumsier hand with larger characters, just as Paul describes, exclaiming, "What large letters I make." But this is not to say that Paul was illiterate, or even semi-literate. Rather, it is to say how skilled these scribes were. Carefully written lines of consistent characters is a trait that reaffirms the historical facts we have of scribes during antiquity. Scribes were often highly trained slaves, servants, or hired hands. Being a scribe was no easy task, and was truly a skill to be mastered. Regarding the topic, Steve Reece writes, "In the ancient world, the production of manuscripts, even as short as a personal letter, was not only a laborious process, but a highly technical one. The duties of a scribe required specialized training, the skill to follow dictation quickly and accurately, probably in a form of shorthand, and then the skill and patience to transform the shorthand version into two clear, even elegant, transcriptions, with reed and ink on a papyrus sheet or roll, one for the author of the letter and the other for the recipient. Therefore, hours of training to master such a skill would have granted scribes a level of proficiency superior to that of any other. This is not to say that those with lesser penmanship, such as Paul, had trouble reading or writing, but rather that they were simply not scribes, and did not require the proficiency one would have needed for the trade. Now, as many may be wondering, do we know who Paul's scribe was? We actually do, at least for one of his letters. In the final chapter of Romans, a chapter famous for its greetings, verse 16:23 reads, "I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord." Here we not only have evidence for a scribe who composed Romans, but also his name, Tertius. While this is the only time Tertius is mentioned in the whole New Testament, we can infer a little bit about this character. For one, we can assume that Tertius, a Latin name, has some ties to Rome, and thus adds his own greeting in the final verses of the letter. Moreover, the act of Tertius adding his own greeting would suggest his involvement in the church, and this might suggest that those who compose Paul's other letters are possibly not involved in the church, and feel no need to add their own personal greetings, as they are not familiar with the intended recipients anyways. Of course, this is an argument from silence, and some scholars offer different opinions on the topic. For example, Silvanus' name is often offered as another possible scribe. According to 1 Peter 5 verse 12, we read, "Through Silvanus, whom I consider a faithful brother, I have written this short letter, to encourage you and testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it." Therefore, following that Silvanus possibly scribed 1 Peter for St. Peter, then maybe Silvanus did the same for Paul. As we know, Silvanus was also active alongside Paul, even being tagged as a joint sender in 1 Thessalonians. But as for what is certain, we can truly only pinpoint Tertius as a verified scribe of Paul's. All in all, what we see from a study of Paul's scribal signatures is a practical outline for how Paul may have composed his letters. Although Paul was not illiterate, employing a scribe that could skillfully record your dictated words into a concise letter was the cultural norm throughout antiquity, and this practice did not exclude the earliest Christians. Scribing was a highly skilled trade and had an assortment of benefits, such as efficiency and legibility. Moreover, through Paul's scribal signatures, we see a practical and human aspect of Paul, especially in Galatians 6:11, where we see Paul compare his own less refined writing to his scribe's pristine and orderly hand. Due to the reproduction of the Pauline letters and the lack of original copies, these visual cues relating to Paul's scribal signatures are lost to history. But the proof of these scribal signatures remain, and we find them scattered through the end of 5 Pauline letters, especially Galatians. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please check out my channel for more similar content.